It was December the 25th, 2003, and Christmas Day in Cotonou, Benin. The weather was nice with a light, warm breeze sweeping in from the Gulf of Guinea, and inside the small terminal at Cotonou airport, the scene was very familiar. Families juggling luggage, agents sorting boarding passes, and ground staff preparing for the afternoon departure, which was one of the few international flights on that particular day. Just outside on the ramp stood a tired-looking Boeing 727 with the blue and white colors of Union des Transports Africains, UTA, hastily painted on it and barely covering the livery of the plane's previous owners. It had arrived a few hours earlier from Conakry, Guinea, and was now being readied for its next leg, which was a short hop over to Beirut with a fuel stop in Libya. Now, there was no reason to think that this flight would be any different from the previous flights with this airline. It was a route that UTA flew regularly, not glamorous or high profile, but very important to the West African diaspora in the country, heading over to the Middle East. Many of the passengers had traveled from landlocked countries nearby, some bussed in from Nigeria or Burkina Faso, carrying basically everything they owned. But like I said, the aircraft itself had definitely seen better days. It was over 25 years old by this stage, built in the United States and once operated by American Airlines. Now though, it was near the end of its service life and had been patched together with used parts of questionable provenance and maintained under the oversight of a struggling regional carrier. But it was still flying, and in this part of the world where options on airlines were very limited, that was enough for the passengers who likely had no idea of the state of the airline. As the ground crew loaded baggage and the passengers began to board, nobody on the tarmac had any reason to expect that this would be the final flight of this particular 727. And that was because everything looked completely routine. But as with so many accidents in aviation, this story actually didn't start suddenly. No, instead, it had been building quietly, piece by piece, through important processes not being followed and corners cut for economical savings. So even though it didn't look like it, the ingredients were actually all there, and in less than an hour, they would finally all come together. The crew who was going to operate UTA Flight 141 arrived on the tarmac just after 1 p.m. local time, walking across the concrete in the West African heat. There was no jet bridge, no air conditioning unit humming beside the aircraft, just a battered 727 baking in the sun and loosely assembled ground crew juggling passengers and baggage around it. In command of the flight was a Libyan national with 11,000 hours of total flight time, most of it having been operated on the Boeing 727. He had previously flown for Libyan Arab Airlines, back when this aircraft type still symbolized progress and modernity, but that was a while ago now, and he was likely quite happy that he just could continue flying it. He was joined in the cockpit by a flight engineer who had racked up 14,000 hours on the 727, as well as a first officer, believed to be another Libyan national, but this report wasn't able to find his professional experience or much info about him at all. Now that was partially because the company, UTA, didn't keep any formal personal records. Joining the flight crew, as always, were 4 cabin crew, 2 mechanics, as well as a local fixer who was responsible for loading baggage and smoothing things over with authorities when things got sticky for whatever reason. The same handful of mechanics and cabin crew then flew on every flight alongside with the same 3 flight crew members without any proper contracts, schedules, or even established maximum duty or rest periods. And they, like the flight crew, were also paid in cash. So in other words, this was a shoestring operation in its purest form. The airline, Union des Transports Africains de Guinée, UTA, wasn't so much a company as it was a financial instrument, owned and controlled by a man named Darwish Kasim and his family. It had no real headquarters, no board of directors, and no safety department. Kasim himself was on board for this flight, riding in the cockpit jump seat, and as we will soon see, that would have its consequences. Now technically, UTA was registered in Guinea, but that was little more than a flag of convenience, because you see, Guinea didn't have the capacity to oversee or regulate an airline. The country's inspectors weren't trained and records weren't audited, so as far as international aviation oversight went, this operation might as well have existed in a vacuum. Now, as I mentioned before, the aircraft itself was just as cobbled together as the airline that operated it. It was registered as 3 X-ray Golf Delta Oscar and had, as I mentioned, started its life flying for American Airlines back in the 1970s, when the tri-jets formed the bulk of the US domestic fleet. Over the years, as newer narrowbodies like the Boeing 737NG and the 757 took over, older ones like the 727 were either retired, sold or scrapped, and this one had ended up in the boneyard until UTA pulled it out of the desert and got it flying again. Now, it is hard to overstate just how marginal that return to service procedure really had been. The aircraft was, after its return, grounded in Lebanon, red flagged by authorities for being in questionable condition. And after that, UTA had only made the very minimum required fixes to get it airworthy and had then flown it straight back to West Africa again. There were no records of corrective maintenance done after this. In fact, there were no records of any maintenance on this plane at all. There were also no logs, no overhaul documents, and no tracking of engine hours. In fact, the engines themselves later showed evidence of having had their serial numbers altered, masking their true time in service, but no one could know for sure. UTA also claimed that they had hired a third-party company to do a feasibility study on the route combination they were intending to operate this aircraft on. That's a study that would have covered market demand, load factors, fuel planning, needed crew composition and duty times. But the investigators would later not be able to find a single piece of that study anywhere. So like so much else about UTA, it likely existed only in theory. Because of all of this, UTA was for all intents and purposes not an airline and therefore had absolutely no business operating an aircraft as complex as a Boeing 727, nor any other airplane for that matter. Its chief pilot, who was also the head of quality assurance, wasn't even rated on the Boeing 727. But the company's problems went even deeper than this. UTA also had no maintenance manuals, no evidence of a minimum equipment list, that's the list that lists onboard items that can be approved missing or damaged for operation, and they also had not kept any of the dispatch records. The BEA later found some operations documents in the airline's files referencing aircraft they had never even owned, like the Lockheed L-1011 and Fokker 50s, as well as destinations that they had never operated to. One BEA investigator described the manuals as clumsily copied from other airlines and obviously written just to fulfill regulatory obligations. And another investigator noted that the most coherent sections in the operations handbook was a generic statement about how safety was everyone's responsibility, something that this airline obviously had no structure or even intention to uphold themselves. Now, I just cannot overemphasize how furious this all makes me. It actually makes me sick to my stomach, and I hope that you feel the same way. On a completely different scale, but still important, it also annoys me how easy it is for our personal information to be harvested, packaged and sold on the web today. Things like your home address, phone numbers, emails and even details about your friends and family is right now being monetized by shady entities known as data brokers, all completely legally. That's actually why you are getting so much spam calls, suspicious emails and strangely accurate scam messages nowadays. But luckily, today's sponsor Incogni can help you clean up your digital footprint, literally with only a few clicks. Once you have signed up, they will track down and contact all data brokers selling your information and compel them to immediately stop doing that, which is something that would take you days or even weeks to do if you try to do it all by yourself. Once Incogni is activated, they will also continue to guard your data and make sure it's removed every time it pops up, which is a great peace of mind, especially when you, like me, realize just how widespread your data is. It is truly shocking. So if you want to try Incogni out, then just scan this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot and use the code PILOT. That will give you a massive 60% discount off their normal price, which is a truly great deal. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. UTA's official headquarters was a desk in a travel agency in Conakry, Guinea, also owned by the same owner, Darwish Kasim, and their check-in operation consisted of a rented counter at the airport, with their only real operational footprint being 2 shipping containers on the airport property. One containing a few spare parts for various systems on the Boeing 727, and the other some stored printed paperwork and bottled water. That was it. No offices, no dispatch center, no crew room, no manuals, nothing. Even the leasing and ownership trail of the aircraft was a maze. The Boeing 727 was technically operated by UTA, but leased through a string of shell companies designed to obscure responsibility. And of course, UTA's ownership structure itself was a true nightmare. Looking into it led investigators on a chase through a web of front companies and financial interests that traced back to a man named Imad Saba. Now, Saba's name wasn't new to these French investigators. He had been linked to a number of nominal airlines that operated on paper only, designed to provide service in parts of the world where authorities didn't have the ability to look closely or ask too many questions. This was all designed so that if anything went wrong, there would be no one to sue or hold accountable, just a paper trail that led into nowhere. Saba's other airlines also operated with similar levels of care, with several of them having already drawn scrutiny for ties to, for example, arms smuggling operations. One of his companies had been named by the United Nations for suspected violations of arms embargoes, and another one of Saba's planes had actually crashed while allegedly ferrying aid into Darfur a while back. So the whole thing looked uncomfortably familiar. Fake paperwork, junk planes, countries with no regulatory teeth, and possibly a business model designed around plausible deniability. Now, I'm telling you this because frankly, this makes me absolutely furious. The aviation industry I love and respect have been built up around strict adherence to rules and international treaties. That is what has provided the foundation for the incredible safety record that we see around international air transport today. So this kind of clownery needs to be both exposed and thoroughly weeded out. On Christmas Day of 2003, the flight that we're about to follow had been filled to capacity. Many of the passengers were members of the Lebanese diaspora, meaning workers and their immediate families who had lived and worked in West Africa for years and were now heading home for the holidays. Since it was Christmas Day, many were bringing bags stuffed with gifts for relatives waiting in Beirut, and others might have been moving home permanently, carrying even more things with them. The check-in process had been a mess, with airport staff not assigning passengers with seat numbers, boarding passes being issued without names, and it was later found by the investigators that numerous seats had also been sold or resold in the terminal building by passengers who weren't intending to travel, just wanting to sell them to other people who weren't even booked. Like I mentioned before, there was a huge demand for these flights, so some people might have made scalping these tickets into a business, like tickets to a concert. This meant that the gate area was loud and chaotic, with children crying, people jostling for position, and crucially, baggage and passengers being loaded onto the aircraft with no regard for weight distribution. The investigators were never able to find anything close to an actual load manifest for this flight, and later tries were made to reconstruct the aircraft's actual weight and balance, which for a normal flight would have been as simple as asking for a copy of the load sheet, but that was not possible here. You see, doing this, filling out a load sheet and giving a copy to the dispatcher before we leave, is something that all pilots have to do before we close the doors, and that is for this exact reason. But UTA was unable to produce any copy of dispatch documentation, not just for this flight, but for any of their flights. It turns out that the Guinean authorities hadn't required them to be kept, and airport services in Cotonou said UTA never asked for load sheet copies from them either. So as far as anyone could tell, no one had been responsible for weighing the baggage, tracking passenger loads, or ensuring that any of this was well documented. What they eventually did find were a handful of old load sheets from a different airline, Alpha Omega Airlines, printed on headed paper with the wrong company name on it, as well as a few stray pages recovered from the cockpit. None of those were accurate. In fact, none of them even agreed with each other, with each one listing a different aircraft basic operating weight, with no indication of which, if any, was actually real. Some even referencing a different version of the Boeing 727 altogether. The aircraft basic operating weight is the weight of the aircraft when it's ready for operation, but without passenger baggage or fuel. And that differs slightly between every aircraft individual, depending on individual configurations, etc. Anyway, here is what we do know about the passenger count at least. 3 X-ray Golf Delta Oscar had 140 passenger seats, plus 4 flight attendant jump seats, 2 cockpit jump seats, and 6 extra seats dedicated to airline personnel. Every one of those were filled, and 2 of the airline's executives were seated in the cockpit, which inadvertently gave them an excellent view of what was about to happen. We know that 86 passengers boarded in Conakry, and 9 of those then got off at Cotonou. The manifest that the pilots were given said that 73 passengers had then been boarded, which would mean 150 in total. And among the passengers were 15 army officers from Bangladesh returning from UN peacekeeping duty in West Africa. The largest group of passengers, though, were, like I mentioned, Lebanese, heading back home, and this group made up 100 of the total passenger count. Now, there were only 146 passenger seats for sale, including the airline personnel seats, 3 of which would have been occupied by the mechanics and the transporter. However, there were also 6 lap-held children, so the 150 passengers would have taken up 144 seats, which comes out to 1 more than was actually available. The real number will never be known, but some estimates say that it could have been as high as 160, which means that there may have been as many as a dozen people without seatbelts and proper seating. About 30 minutes before the takeoff, the cockpit voice recorder started recording and immediately caught some worrying discussions in the cockpit. The first recorded statement came from the first officer. The sheets they gave us don't have the load. What is that? Come on. The sheets they gave us don't have the weight, only passengers. The captain then responded, don't worry, we have the passenger manifest without weight. Now this points to the first officer being aware that things were not being done right, because he then continued by saying, each of them are bringing on board the airplane like 200 kilo suitcases. 200 kilos, that's not possible. Get them to unload them and weigh them. Then we will know if we manage to take off. The people, I'll tell you, it will be quite a performance if we manage to take off today. At least let them put the exact weight so that we know. Let them put the exact weight so we can calculate it. Here, the Director General of the airline intervened from the jump seat, saying, but the weight is indicated there. But the first officer just responded back, there is no weight. Each passenger came on board with a 20 kilo bag. That's impossible if you have an airplane with 100 passengers. If this airplane takes off today, you will see. If this airplane takes off, otherwise we're going to drop into the sea. You will see when the aircraft will take off, or we will crash into the sea. Now that was a very chilling statement. After that, you can hear from the conversation that the Director General realizes that he's likely wrong here, but he tries to deflect the blame and pressure the pilots into just continuing, saying, I'm sorry, as soon as we arrive in Beirut, I'm going to tell him off, likely referring to his father here. What can I do? What can I do? And on the return, I cannot do anything. I came, I made this problem, I cannot return. The first officer then continued by trying to reason and compromise around the situation, saying, no, don't send the passengers back, but the baggage must stay here, meaning on the ground in Cotonou. Now this CVR recording clearly shows that the 2 pilots, and especially the first officer, was not happy about what was going on, especially when it came to the weight and the distribution. They knew that the numbers they had been handed were likely meaningless, and they also felt powerless in this situation, not backed up by any real manuals, contract, or enforceable rules. So in the end, they just proceeded. This is an absolutely horrible position to be in, and I really feel bad for these pilots. It is easy to sit here and condemn them, saying that they should never have accepted this chaos, but being in this situation in reality, with their boss urging them to proceed and with these type of irregularities likely being the norm, makes it very, very hard to say stop. Most people today complain about the abundance of rules and red tape, not realizing that a lot of it actually forms the foundation of our ability to stand up for ourselves. Now, the airplane was nearly overweight, but given the length of the runway, the performance of the aircraft was actually still enough. What was far more important here was how the aircraft had been balanced. You see, that matters hugely because you must have that information in order to configure the aircraft correctly for the takeoff. But these pilots had no idea of how many people were behind them, how many bags there were, how heavy they were, and where that had been loaded. So before we go any further here, we need to discuss the stabilizer trim setting. Stabilizer trim is a mechanism that controls the angle of the horizontal stabilizer mounted on the tail. That is what sets the aircraft's default pitch attitude. So the more nose-up trim that you apply, the more the stabilizer will push the tail downwards. Now for takeoff, it is absolutely crucial that this trim setting is correct, because with too little nose-up trim, the aircraft can become almost impossible to rotate, and with too much, it can start rotating by itself before the rotation speed is met, which was something that had actually happened on an earlier flight with this aircraft. And that had forced the pilots to push forward on their yoke to keep the nose on the ground until the correct speed had been met. Now, in order to set this trim correctly, you need to know the aircraft's weight and its distribution of fuel, baggage and people, but this crew crucially only had one of those three. They knew how much fuel they had, and they knew what tanks that this fuel was in, but the other two were guesses at best, especially about the baggage. So let's quickly break down how we pilots calculate this trim setting and how it all works. You see, first we have to think of something called the center of gravity, or CG. That's the point where the weight of the aircraft can be thought to be concentrated. You know, that point on the pencil where you place your finger in order to perfectly balance it? That's the center of gravity. Next, we have the center of lift, also called the center of pressure, which is where the aerodynamic forces lifting the aircraft can be taught to act. Now, because the wings are swept and tapered as they go outward, the lift distribution changes along the span. So, to standardize all of this, engineers have also started using something called the mean aerodynamic chord, or MAC. That's basically an average chord line from front to back, and it serves as the baseline for measuring the center of gravity's position. Now, you want your center of gravity to be positioned forward of the center of lift, because that will cause a pitch forward motion, whilst at the same time the horizontal stabilizer provides a small downforce on the tail to counterbalance this. And it's actually that balance between the center of gravity, the center of lift, and the stabilizer downforce that makes the airplane controllable and provides a stable range of weight distribution within the aircraft. Without that, an aircraft would just tip over in either direction as soon as something or someone moved. But it's important to know that the position of the center of gravity have to be within a certain range in order for the aircraft to fly safely. That is actually why you have to sit on your assigned seat during takeoff and landing. So, knowing that, when loading an aircraft, the crew calculates where the center of gravity falls along the mean aerodynamic chord, expressed as a percentage of it. So a CG of 25% MAC means the center of gravity is at a quarter of the way down from that imaginary chord line from the front, and the manufacturer then provides a recommended stabilizer trim value for each CG position. More forward CG, more nose-up trim required. It is as simple as that. So, what happened here then? Well, the pilots assumed a total weight of 172,000 pounds and a CG of 19% MAC. That's what they used to calculate their trim setting to 6.75 units nose up. Now, those 19% was basically a guess. It seems to have been based on very little evidence except the pilot's intuition and where it should be on a correctly loaded aircraft at the weight that they were estimating. But it turns out that the real center of gravity wasn't 19%. It was actually at 14%, 5 whole percentage points further forward, and that was because the baggage handlers in Cotonou had stuffed almost all of the baggage into the forward cargo hold. So remember what should happen to the trim setting if the center of gravity was moved forward? Yeah. With the center of gravity at 14%, the correct trim should have been 7.75 units nose up, not 6.75. And that extra unit of trim might not sound like much, but in a situation like this, where everything is this marginal, it would come to matter a lot. This meant that the crew now had a mistrimmed aircraft, which was likely also overweight, and it was soon to be facing into a very light wind on a very hot, humid West African afternoon. Now, once all of the checklist had been completed, the pilots wanted to start their engines and initiate their taxiing, but as it turns out, not even that was going to be easy, because there were now apparently passengers standing in the aisles refusing to sit down. So the cabin crew had to try and wrangle everybody into their seats, if they had one, before the aircraft could start moving. The pilots knew that they were overweight, and they therefore also knew that they likely would need every inch of the runway they had ahead of them. So just to be a little bit extra careful, they had selected a VR rotation speed of 137 knots, corresponding to a takeoff weight of 187,000 pounds, which was 15,000 pounds higher than their declared weight. But at least this should give them a better shot at rotating with enough speed to fly. Now, this was a sound decision by the crew to build in a little bit of safety margins in their performance calculations, and they also decided to take off with their air conditioning system off to get even more thrust out of their engines. But like I explained before, thrust was not going to be their main problem here. Anyway, the aircraft proceeded to taxi out and backtrack, and at the time 13:58 and 1 second, the 727 had completed its backtrack to the start of runway 24, and the first officer, who was going to be pilot flying for the flight, moved the 3 thrust levers forward for takeoff. The aircraft started slowly accelerating, and then they rolled and rolled and rolled. Even the controllers in the tower commented on how long it was taking for the 727 to just accelerate, and something was clearly wrong here. Despite full power from all 3 engines, it took far longer to reach the rotation speed than it should have, so when 137 knots finally passed and the captain called, "B1, rotate," the first officer pulled back on the yoke, but nothing really happened. The flight data recorder showed a delayed, shallow rotation by just a few degrees, and the investigators later used a performance reconstruction method known as inverse solving to work out what happened here. In essence, they took the aircraft's acceleration, rotation point, and climb rate, and then worked backward to determine what combination of weight, center of gravity, and trim setting could have produced that performance. The 727's aerodynamics were well understood by this point, and with enough data from the black box, the BAA could plug the numbers into a certified flight dynamics model, which led them to a takeoff weight of 188,500 pounds, well above what the crew had declared, and very close to the maximum allowable for the available runway. In fact, this weight was even higher than the conservative weight that the crew had used for their performance calculations. The cockpit voice recorder now captured the captain shouting in panic, "Rotate! Rotate! More, more, more! Pull! Pull!" And just as important as what the CVR captured was what it didn't, which was the sound of any mechanical failures, alarms, or abnormal noises. The pilots were fighting the airplane, but it in itself had not failed them, and they therefore had no idea why the nose just wouldn't rise from the runway. But we do. This was because the stabilizer trim was now not providing enough downforce on the tail to allow the elevators to pivot the nose up at the normal rate. Now, taking off in this configuration was still technically possible, but it would have required an immediate and aggressive full aft input on the controls, and in this case it would calculate that around 100 pounds or 45 kilos would have been needed. But that was far more than what this first officer would have been used to, and it would have felt extreme to any trained pilot, which meant that it now didn't happen. But you might still wonder, why didn't he just try to pull back harder when he felt that it didn't work? Well, that's hard to know for sure, but maybe it was because for most pilots, flying just doesn't really work like that. In a healthy aircraft, a smooth and measured control input is the norm, especially during takeoff where excessive pitch rates can otherwise lead to tail strikes or a stall. So a sudden, full deflection pull on the controls just shouldn't be needed and could be a sign of something else being wrong, maybe with the flight controls themselves. We can never know for sure what he was thinking here, but the fact is that faced with a sluggish aircraft that felt subtly wrong, the first officer hesitated for just a second too long. So by the time that he did pull harder, the aircraft was now running out of runway. Roughly 300 meters before the end, the nose finally did begin to rise and the aircraft lifted off, but just barely. They were now in the air, hanging in the ground effect, but not really climbing. Instead, they were just wallowing about a meter or two above the ground, desperately trying to build airspeed and to rotate further. But 118 meters beyond the end of runway 24 sat a concrete blockhouse forming part of the localizer installation. It was only 2.5 meters high, and since it was built back in the 1960s, it did not meet modern clearance standards, but it was still there because Benin just couldn't afford modernizing its airport at this time. The aircraft cleared the end of the runway with just 1.2 meters of altitude, but remember, the blockhouse ahead of them was 2.4 meters tall, which would prove too much. So at time 13, 59 and 11 seconds, just 70 seconds after the takeoff roll had started, the landing gear of the 727 struck the top of the blockhouse. It hit it hard enough to tear off the roof, rotating it 45 degrees and then throwing it 9 meters downrange. And a worker that was inside of the blockhouse was injured by the debris as the plane just plowed through it. This impact also ripped the landing gear out of the aircraft and damaged the right wing flaps, robbing the aircraft further of some much needed lift. From this point, the outcome was basically sealed. At this speed, without those flaps and after having much of its kinetic energy sapped by the collision, the plane was only going to go one way, and that was down. It continued to fly a little bit further whilst descending rapidly, clipping a perimeter wall with a tail cone before finally slamming into the beachfront outside of the airport perimeter. The fuselage then broke into 3 major sections, with the tail shearing off, the cockpit snapping forward and the main body cartwheeling into the shallow water upside down. Inside of the cabin, the passengers were now thrown around mercilessly. Some weren't even belted in, and the result of that was that many were injured or killed instantly. Others sadly drowned when they couldn't escape the sinking cabin, because in the chaos it would have been almost impossible to orient themselves and determine which direction was up and down. Now the water was shallow, shallower than the height of the fuselage itself, but since it had landed in an inverted position, it was now more than enough deep to make this disaster even worse. Tragically, the first officer, the one who had pleaded for a baggage offload and actually predicted the outcome, suffered serious injuries during the initial impacts and later succumbed in hospital. The captain, flight engineer and the director general all survived by scrambling out through the gaping holes torn into the fuselage behind them, and that was actually a common theme here. Most of the survivors were the ones who could swim out through the breaches in the airframe. Everyone else were trapped. The emergency response from the airport was also painfully slow. Cotonou didn't have a dedicated airport fire and rescue unit capable of responding to a crash of this scale, so local authorities, fishermen and civilians were among the first ones to the scene, wading into the water to help however they could. And in the end, at least 141 people perished as a result of the accident. Many of the victims were never formally identified because they had boarded without any record of their names. And of course, the chaos surrounding boarding and tickets meant that we have no idea how many were actually on board. All we know is that there were 141 bodies and 22 survivors recovered from the site, with all of the survivors receiving some kind of injury. That totals out to 163, including 153 passengers and 10 crew, which of course doesn't match the 143 available passenger seats on board, even after accounting for the babies, nor the 145 passengers referred to by the pilots on the cockpit voice recorder, or the 149 passengers on the semi-improvised manifest and weight and balance sheet. 12 of the victims found couldn't be identified, and 7 people that were listed as missing didn't match the 12 unidentified bodies, which means that the 7 missing people were possibly washed out to the sea and never found. This sadly also means that the total death toll has never been fully established. It could be anywhere from 141 to 148. In the days after the crash, what little order existed around UTA began to unravel. With no formal manifest, no passenger records, and no local investigative authority with the expertise to handle an accident of this magnitude, Benin soon asked for help. And that call was answered by France's BEA, the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, who arrived on site and quickly took over. Their final report ended up being scathing, to say the least. It included the word apparently 8 times, and that's the only word that they could use to describe a company that only half existed, flying an airplane that had no verifiable history, with a crew whose qualifications were unverifiable, on a flight with no manifest into a crash that killed dozens. And yet, there were no criminal convictions following this, no lawsuits that stuck, and no enforcement action from Guinea. The BEA's report pulled no punches here. It called out every failure it found, operational, regulatory as well as ethical. And it made clear that this wasn't just a bad airline. This was a complete breakdown of everything aviation is supposed to stand for. This was basically criminal, and the report called for reforms all the way up to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. The investigators implored them to make it clearer what responsibilities member states had when it came to licensing and overseeing local operators. If that was not done, it could otherwise overthrow the whole idea of international aviation cooperation, since its bedrock is trust in each member state's capability and competence to do just that. Today, the remains of that Boeing 727 are gone, but its story still matters because it shows what can happen when no one is watching, when corners are cut, and when safety becomes a slogan instead of a standard. And that is actually why we here on Mentour Pilot tell these types of stories. Not just to remember those who were lost, but to make sure that the mistakes that claimed their lives aren't forgotten. Now, if you want to see how aircraft are supposed to be operated, Ben and I have created a course that is open to anyone who is curious about how Boeing 737s are flown. It includes more than 10 hours of instruction, explanations and fun anecdotes from our careers, plus workbooks, checklists and charts. You don't need a simulator to follow the course, even though it will change the way that you are flying if you are using one. And if you use this QR code or go to virtual737course.com, that's virtual737course.com, and use the code MentorPilot, you will get a 20% discount off the normal price. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.